Hey guys, tonight we're starting with humanity's oldest friend, and probably its worst decision: alcohol. You know, from ancient temples all the way to medieval taverns, we've been coming up with creative ways to absolutely wreck our mornings since the dawn of civilization. So before you get too comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy the stories I tell here. And please, drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see who's joining in from all corners of the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe get a fan going for that soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Before we had civilization, before we had writing, before anyone had even figured out how to boil water without setting the hut on fire, someone accidentally invented getting drunk. This happened somewhere around 7000 BCE in Neolithic China. A farmer probably left a pot of rice, honey, and fruit just sitting out for way too long. That mixture started to ferment, just like all neglected things eventually do, and it created this mysterious, bubbling potion that smelled like a mix of curiosity and future regret. At some point, some human, maybe hungry, maybe just stupid, but definitely bored, decided to drink it. That moment right there was the real dawn of human history. Not the wheel, not the discovery of fire, but that instant someone stared at a suspicious jar of spoiled fruit and thought, yeah, I'll risk it. The first sip was probably confusing. The second one must have felt amazing. By the third, our prehistoric hero was likely trying to explain his feelings to a goat. The world started spinning. The trees suddenly looked philosophical, and everyone around him seemed like a really great dancer. It must have felt like touching something divine, which is probably what they told all their friends right before collapsing into a pile of mud. Congratulations, humanity. You've just discovered alcohol. And about 5 hours later, you discovered the concept of consequences. Archaeologists would later uncover 9,000-year-old pottery jars at a site called Jayahu, still stained with the residue of that ancient brew, a mix of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. It's officially the earliest known cocktail, the prehistoric version of just mixing whatever's in the fridge. Chemical analysis confirmed it was fermented, which means this wasn't an accident anymore. It was the start of a tradition. Someone got drunk, somehow survived it, and then decided to do it all over again on purpose. And with that, the world's very first hangover arrived. The next morning, our ancient innovator woke up in a puddle of his own choices, completely dehydrated, dizzy, and in that moment, invented the first known excuse. It must have been something I ate. This wasn't just a drink. It was humanity's first coping mechanism, a portable vacation from reality, long before there were jobs, taxes, or annoying neighbors to blame for things. So yes, while later civilizations would go on to build pyramids, write laws, and split the atom, this is where it all truly began. With one forgotten jar, one terrible decision, and one species realizing that sometimes oblivion tastes pretty good. If you ever needed proof that human beings have their priorities a little backward, just look at Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BCE, while the rest of the natural world was busy evolving for survival, humanity invented beer. And only after that did they think, you know what might go well with this? Food. Yes, you heard that right. Beer came before bread. People were brewing barley long before they ever figured out how to bake it into a loaf. Archaeologists have found ancient tablets that show Sumerians joyfully drinking from these large, communal pots using long straws. Because apparently, even back then, nobody wanted to share germs. These weren't just small cups either. Just try to picture a group of adults all hunched over what looks like a muddy punch bowl, sipping away in silence and trying to pretend it's some kind of spiritual experience. That was civilization's first happy hour. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer, they built their entire belief system around it. They had a goddess of brewing named Ninkasi, because of course they did. Her hymn, and yes, there's a hymn, actually doubles as a recipe for beer. It's probably the oldest surviving homebrew guide on the entire planet. Modern civilization, it turns out, began not with philosophy, but with a tipsy choir singing praises to a divine bartender. Beer wasn't some kind of luxury, it was essential infrastructure. The water in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't exactly safe to drink. It was more of a health gamble. But beer, because it was brewed and fermented, was purified by the boiling process and its alcohol content. In other words, drinking beer wasn't irresponsible. It was the healthiest choice you could make. Imagine trying to explain that to your doctor today. Daily rations of beer were given out to everyone, workers, priests, even children. And it wasn't the fizzy, golden stuff we know now. It was thick, sweet, and full of little floating barley bits. Archaeologists describe it as nutrient-rich. The modern translation for that is drinkable oatmeal with a buzz. And yet, somehow, this murky brew is what fueled the world's first cities. People farmed, they built temples, and they wrote on cuneiform tablets, all while maintaining a steady state of mild intoxication. Which honestly explains why about half of the early Sumerian laws sound like they were written right at closing time. So yes, beer built civilization. Not logic, not language, not ambition. Just a bunch of dehydrated farmers solving the world's problems, one foamy bowl at a time. If Mesopotamia invented beer, it was Egypt that turned it into a full-blown lifestyle. By 3000 BCE, the Nile Valley had completely mastered the art of getting tipsy before lunch. Beer wasn't a treat, it was part of their daily nutrition. It showed up at breakfast, at prayer as wages, and even at funerals. Technically, you could live your entire life fueled by just bread, onions, and beer, which might explain why most ancient Egyptians looked both very busy and perpetually tired. For the common folk, the beer was cheap and thick, more like a liquid porridge than a drink. It was brewed from barley and emmer wheat, sweetened up with some dates, and then poured into these clay jugs that probably hadn't been cleaned since the last pharaoh's reign. Still, it was a whole lot safer than drinking water from the Nile, which came with a bonus helping of parasites. The average peasant was drinking 2 to 3 liters of this stuff a day, which means that half of Egyptian civilization was built by people who were just quietly buzzed all the time. Even the children drank it. Not because ancient Egypt was some kind of wild party, but because sober hydration just wasn't a safe option. When the water is guaranteed to give you dysentery, having beer for breakfast starts to sound perfectly reasonable. Parents would fill up little clay cups for their kids and send them off to school like it was a juice box. And we wonder why mathematics was invented somewhere else. The upper class, meanwhile, preferred wine, which was the official beverage of people who didn't have to do manual labor. Pharaohs would import it from places like Syria and Greece, store it in these ornate jars, and pretend it was a symbol of their refinement instead of just grape juice that had gone rogue. Cleopatra herself supposedly had her own vineyard, because apparently, ruling Egypt required both charm and a good Cabernet. The temples were brewing on an industrial scale. The workers who built the pyramids were actually paid in daily rations of bread and beer, meaning the most iconic monument on Earth was fueled by carbohydrates and a mild state of inebriation. Even the afterlife came fully stocked with it. Tomb paintings show servants pouring beer for the dead, ensuring they'd have eternal refreshment and, presumably, eternal hangovers. So, while Egypt gave us things like papyrus, geometry, and the concept of divine kingship, it also gave us something a bit more relatable. The timeless truth that life is just a little easier to endure when it's slightly blurry around the edges. While the Egyptians were busy drinking their bread soup and calling it beer, the Chinese were up to something far more refined, or at least they were pretending to be. Around 3000 BCE, early brewers in the Yellow River Valley started fermenting rice, millet, and fruit into beverages that actually tasted like they were made on purpose. Archaeologists have discovered these ornate bronze vessels coated in a residue that once held an early form of Chinese wine, which is just more proof that humanity's talent for turning dinner into liquid regret had officially become a global phenomenon. Unlike other cultures that just kind of stumbled into intoxication, the Chinese organized it. Fermentation wasn't just some happy accident. It was chemistry with a religious backing. Alcohol was seen as a gift from the heavens, a bridge that connected mortals to their ancestors. That sounds poetic until you remember that this bridge usually ended with someone singing completely off-key before passing out in a rice field. Drinking became a central part of ritual life. Kings and nobles would host these elaborate ceremonies where wine was offered to the spirits and then immediately offered to themselves, just to make sure it was safe, of course. Ancient texts even mention officials who lost their jobs for being too sober at court banquets. In other words, not drinking wasn't just uncool, it was politically risky. The Chinese didn't just brew casually, they engineered it. They refined their fermentation vessels, they standardized recipes, and they even documented the proper etiquette for drinking. By the time of the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, court life was basically one long, well-funded tasting session. There were official drinking songs, drinking cups shaped like different animals, and inevitably, the first government warnings about drinking in excess. Because even the world's oldest bureaucracy realized that productivity tends to plummet when half your ministers are horizontal. Still, alcohol was considered sacred, the water of life, as some of the early poets called it. It inspired calligraphy, music, and the kind of philosophy that only really makes sense until you try to reread it sober. Even Confucius, the future champion of discipline, warned against drunkenness with the kind of weary tone that suggests he had some personal experience with it. So, while other civilizations were still trying to figure out how to keep their beer from exploding, the Chinese were already holding formal banquets, toasting their ancestors, and probably forgetting half of their toasts by the time dessert came around. Civilization, it seems, doesn't truly begin until someone's offering spiritual enlightenment with a side of fermented fruit. If there's one thing that seems to unite all of these early civilizations, it's their absolute determination to make sure someone was drinking when they invented writing. In Mesopotamia, around 2700 BCE, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a plot device. The world's oldest known story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like an ancient cautionary tale about friendship, mortality, and the dangers of drinking outside your comfort zone. The story introduces us to Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals until a woman lures him into civilization with two very convincing arguments: bread and beer. After his first drink, Enkidu became human, which is a very polite way of saying he discovered the magic of having lowered standards. The Sumerians didn't believe that alcohol corrupted man. They believed it completed him. Somewhere, a modern philosopher is still trying to argue that same point with a lot less evidence. In Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a social thing, it was spiritual. The temples often doubled as breweries. Priests would moonlight as bartenders, and offerings to the gods almost always included a fresh pint. Archaeologists have found clay tablets with ancient recipes, which were basically hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. They read less like scripture and more like a medieval pub song. Praise the brew, stir the mash, and may your liver hold out for another year. Beer was considered liquid bread, a phrase that made fasting sound virtuous and happy hour sound holy. It was also practical, a way to preserve grain and keep it from rotting. Workers who were building temples and canals received daily beer rations as part of their wages. Somewhere between the fifth and sixth sip, civilization started to make a bit more sense, writing contracts, dividing up labor, and occasionally passing out next to the ziggurat. The result was history's first bureaucracy, completely fueled by barley. Accountants were recording beer rations, priests were blessing the barrels, and poets were immortalizing the feeling of a good buzz. Ancient tablets even include complaints from workers about receiving beer that was too weak. That's right. The world's first customer service feedback was a 4,000-year-old Yelp review about watered-down ale. So while philosophers would later debate the meaning of life, the people of Mesopotamia had already found it, right at the bottom of a communal beer pot. Humanity's first great epic didn't just celebrate heroism. It celebrated the universal truth that no great story ever started with someone eating a salad. If Mesopotamia drank for civilization and Egypt drank for religion, the Greeks drank for conversation, and sometimes to forget the conversation they just had. By 600 BCE, Greece had elevated alcohol from a simple refreshment to a full-blown social institution. It was called the symposium, a word that literally means drinking together, which, to be fair, is still a cornerstone of Western philosophy. A symposium wasn't a tavern or a frat party, though the line could get pretty thin. It was a structured drinking event that had rules, music, poetry, and at least one person pretending to be profound. The guests would recline on these couches, servants would pour the wine, and everyone would discuss ethics until ethics stopped mattering. They even appointed a symposiarch, who was the designated adult in charge of watering down the wine. Because Greek wine was so strong, it could make a Spartan want to hug someone. And yes, they always watered it down. Mixing wine with water was considered the mark of a civilized person. Drinking it straight was seen as barbaric, something the Thracians did right before they invaded your city. The Greeks genuinely believed that moderation was what separated man from beast, which is pretty ironic, considering the average symposium ended with someone crying, singing, or waking up next to a broken lyre. The gods, of course, had their own drinking scene. Dionysus, the god of wine and chaos, was the divine patron of both theater and hangovers. His followers would roam the countryside, dancing, shouting, and making modern music festivals look like knitting clubs. To the Greeks, intoxication wasn't just an indulgence. It was a state of temporary madness that was blessed by heaven itself. Philosophers weren't immune to it either. Plato, in his Dialogue Symposium, used drinking as a metaphor for love and divine truth, because apparently nothing says eternal wisdom like slurred metaphysics. One can just imagine Socrates, cup in hand, insisting that virtue is knowledge, while everyone else was busy debating whose cup that was. The Greeks did, however, give the world its first recorded hangover cure: eating cabbage before you start drinking. It didn't work, of course, but it did confirm humanity's eternal optimism in the face of making bad decisions. So yes, the Greeks mixed logic with wine, reason with chaos, and they gave birth to Western philosophy somewhere between refills. Civilization had discovered something crucial. Deep thoughts are always a little bit easier when you can blame them on the alcohol. Every civilization seems to have its party god, but the Greeks really outdid everyone with Dionysus, the divine embodiment of wine, ecstasy, and poor impulse control. While other deities were handing down moral codes or laws, Dionysus just showed up barefoot with a bottle and said, "Let's feel something." His cult spread across the Mediterranean like spilled wine. His followers, mostly women who were called Maenads, would abandon their homes to join these wild processions into the mountains. There, under the influence of fermented grape juice and divine enthusiasm, they would sing, dance, and occasionally tear apart small animals. It was the ancient equivalent of festival chaos, but, religious. To outsiders, this all looked completely insane. But to believers, it was a form of transcendence. The Greeks saw drunkenness not as a sin, but as a divine state, a temporary madness that stripped away logic and allowed mortals to get a glimpse of the gods. In short, Dionysus was history's first spiritual excuse for making bad decisions. His festivals, the Dionysia, were wild, joyful, and completely mandatory. They started out as wine-soaked parades and eventually ended up inventing theater. Yes, Western drama literally began as a drinking festival. Tragedy and comedy were born in the same place where someone once shouted, "Who drank all the amphory?" Actors wore masks, choruses sang hymns, and playwrights competed for prizes, all while the audience maintained a polite level of intoxication that modern critics would probably call immersive participation. But Dionysus wasn't all just a party. His myths also warned that rejecting joy was a dangerous thing to do. King Pentheus tried to ban his cult, calling it indecent, which ended very poorly for him when the Maenads, in a frenzy, mistook him for a lion and solved the problem violently. The moral of the story is, never get between a Greek and their weekend plans. For the philosophers, Dionysus represented the chaos that lives inside the human soul. He was the opposite of Apollo, the god of order. Together, they symbolized the eternal tension between reason and instinct. Or to put it less academically, the voice that tells you to be responsible and the other one that says, "One more won't hurt." In Dionysus, the Greeks found both creation and destruction, the bliss of losing control and the hangover that always follows enlightenment. Civilization needed both of these gods. After all, without Apollo, we would have no structure. And without Dionysus, we'd have no stories worth telling. When it came to alcohol, the Romans didn't just drink, they industrialized it. If the Greeks drank for philosophy, the Romans drank for literally everything else: politics, religion, hygiene, and sheer boredom. They had a saying, "In vino veritas," which means in wine there is truth. That probably explains why so many Roman truths ended with bad decisions and the rise of new emperors. Wine was the fuel that ran the empire. It flowed through the aqueducts of their social life, from the slums all the way to the Senate. Everybody drank it: soldiers, farmers, slaves, emperors, and even the gods in their myths. It was so essential that soldiers received daily wine rations instead of water, which raises a few questions about Roman military strategy. Marching hundreds of miles through Gaul while mildly buzzed. That's a bold move, Caesar. Roman vineyards stretched all across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They cultivated hundreds of different varieties of grapes, none of which were aged, filtered, or remotely pleasant. Ancient wine was syrupy, acidic, and often mixed with honey, herbs, seawater, or basically anything that might distract from the actual taste. Think less of a fine vintage and more of a liquid dare. At their feasts, guests would recline on couches, surrounded by silver cups and a whole lot of regret. Servants poured endlessly while musicians played, and philosophers shouted half-coherent Latin about the nature of virtue. Drinking wasn't about the taste, it was about status. The richer the Roman, the more bizarre the ingredients in their wine. Caligula supposedly mixed pearls into his just to prove how wealthy he was, or maybe just to explain why everyone at dinner looked so terrified. Of course, there were some attempts at moderation. The Stoics warned against excess, claiming that self-control was the path to wisdom. But the Stoics were also the same people who had to live under Nero, so you can forgive them for occasionally breaking their own rules. Public drunkenness wasn't condemned, it was kind of expected. Poets wrote verses about their hangovers, and even the gods were known to drink heavily. Bacchus, the Roman version of Dionysus, had his own festivals that were so chaotic the Senate eventually had to ban them. Naturally, that just made them twice as popular. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and entire empires. But its true legacy might just be social drinking. When the empire finally fell, it wasn't just to barbarians or bad politics. It was, at least in part, to the eternal Roman habit of raising a glass and saying, "We'll deal with it tomorrow." While the Greeks were philosophizing over their wine, and the Romans were practically drowning in it, the Persians were turning drinking into literature. They treated wine the way most people treat religion, with devotion, with ritual, and with the occasional public scandal. In ancient Achaemenid Persia, kings would host banquets that could feed a small city. The historian Herodotus claimed that guests were expected to get drunk and then make important decisions. Because, according to Persian logic, a plan that was tested both while sober and while intoxicated had double the integrity. It was a system that probably worked great until someone suggested invading Greece after dessert. But the real poetry of wine came centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, when alcohol became a theological controversy with a big side of irony. The Quran banned it, yet Persian poets just couldn't stop writing about it. They called it the forbidden nectar, the ruby of the soul, liquid wisdom. Basically, it was the world's first creative loophole. No one mastered the art of poetic intoxication quite like Omar Khayyam, the 11th century astronomer, mathematician, and wine enthusiast who managed to turn hangovers into haikus. His Rubaiyat reads like a soft rebellion, with verses just dripping with nostalgia, philosophy, and a little bit of subtle blasphemy. "A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou," he wrote, which is ancient Persian for date night under house arrest. In truth, Persian society had a very complex relationship with the bottle. Publicly, wine was sinful. Privately, it was practically an art form. Aristocrats would drink in these lush gardens, surrounded by fountains, poetry, and plausible deniability. They toasted to love, to beauty, and occasionally to the hypocrisy of their own laws. It was the kind of cultural tension that only a civilization that was both brilliant and deeply self-aware could possibly sustain. Persian physicians even prescribed wine for health reasons, diluted of course, to strengthen the spirit and improve digestion. So yes, even medieval doctors were handing out excuses. By the time travelers from Europe started arriving, they were shocked to find that the Persians, who were officially a dry culture, were quietly running some of the most refined wineries in the entire world. The Persian relationship with alcohol was a constant balancing act. One hand was writing scripture, while the other was uncorking a metaphor. They didn't just drink to forget. They drank to remember things beautifully. While Rome was sipping its spiced wine and reciting poetry about the empire, the so-called barbarians of Northern Europe were doing something far more efficient, getting unapologetically drunk. The Celts, the Germans, and the Norse didn't really care about etiquette, philosophy, or the proper dilution ratios. They cared about results, namely, forgetting about the winter and improving their confidence before a battle. The Greeks called them barbarians because they didn't mix their wine with water. The barbarians just called the Greeks boring. Their preferred drinks were mead and ale, both of which came in quantities that could probably drown a small child. Mead, which is fermented honey and water, was the drink of heroes, kings, and anyone who could manage to stand upright long enough to refill their horn. The Vikings believed that mead came from the gods themselves, specifically from a mythical vat filled with honey and poetry. The fact that this beverage inspired both war songs and spontaneous axe-throwing contests says a lot about how effective it was. The Celts had their own kind of beer, brewed in clay pots and flavored with herbs instead of hops. They would drink it from these large communal bowls, shouting toasts that probably sounded really inspiring at the time and completely incoherent the next morning. In Celtic culture, hospitality meant you kept refilling your guest's cup until they either achieved spiritual enlightenment or just passed out. Meanwhile, the Germans developed an ale that was so strong that even Roman diplomats mentioned it with a note of caution. When Tacitus wrote about the German tribes, he described them as fierce, brave, and very fond of drunken councils, which is ancient Latin for they keep making military plans they can't remember. But drinking wasn't just for recreation, it was a ritual. To the northern tribes, alcohol was what connected them to their ancestors and their gods. Warriors would drink before raids to gain courage and after battle, to forget what they'd done with it. Mead was considered sacred at funerals, at weddings, and basically at any occasion that could be made slightly louder. When Rome finally fell, it wasn't the barbarians drinking that shocked them. It was the realization that these, Uncivilized people had just been celebrating life the whole time. Where Rome had laws, they had toasts. Where Rome had rhetoric, they had rhythm. In the end, the so-called barbarians didn't just conquer the empire, they outdrank it. And that, in its own way, might just be history's most intoxicating victory. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, it left behind three things: bad roads, suspicious water, and an enormous collective hangover. Into that chaos stepped a new kind of hero, the monk. They didn't wear armor, they didn't wield swords, and they didn't chase after glory. They brewed beer. Yes, while the barbarians were busy inventing new kingdoms and plundering libraries, monks were quietly perfecting the art of fermentation. In cold, drafty monasteries from France to Bavaria, they discovered that beer could be more than just a survival fluid. It could be a form of holy hydration. During periods of fasting, when solid food was forbidden but liquids were still allowed, monks brewed a thick, nourishing beer that they nicknamed liquid bread. It was practical theology. You could obey God, stay hydrated, and feel pleasantly detached from all of your earthly suffering. Medieval monastic beer wasn't the light, golden brew that we know today. It was dense, it was cloudy, and it was packed with calories. It was more like a meal you could pour than a drink you could chug. Monks refined recipes. They experimented with different yeasts, and they standardized brewing temperatures centuries before craft beer became a personality trait. Some of them even kept brewing logs that were more detailed than the royal chronicles, because, priorities. Every monastery had its own unique style. The Benedictines favored a malty sweetness. The Cistercians aimed for purity. And the Trappists perfected patience, which is the most useful virtue when your entire existence revolves around waiting for something to ferment. Beer wasn't just for sustenance, though. It was an economic engine. Monks sold it to pilgrims, to travelers, and to anyone who was desperate to forget about feudalism for an evening. The church tolerated all of this because, frankly, it worked. Beer was safer to drink than water, and it kept the general population content. A mildly intoxicated peasantry was a peaceful one. And since the monasteries controlled the production, holiness stayed comfortably profitable. Some historians actually credit these monks with saving beer itself. Without their careful record keeping, the art of brewing might have vanished right alongside Roman plumbing and dental hygiene. Instead, they turned it into a science. Today, when you crack open a Belgian ale, you're tasting the legacy of men who took vows of silence and then invented a drink that made silence truly enjoyable. So, while knights were out winning glory and kings were claiming crowns, the monks won something far more enduring: the eternal gratitude of anyone who's ever needed to make medieval life a little more bearable. While the monks were busy brewing salvation one barrel at a time, everyone else in medieval Europe was simply trying to stay cheerful, or at the very least, hydrated. This is where mead comes in, the golden, honey-based ancestor of all comfort drinks. Before hops became fashionable, mead was the sweet, sticky drink of choice for kings, peasants, and anyone who needed to forget about the weather for a few hours. Mead had ancient roots, but it really found its true calling during the Dark Ages, when it shone like liquid sunlight in a world that was mostly mud and superstition. It was incredibly easy to make, just honey, water, and a little bit of reckless optimism. Fermentation did the rest of the work. In Northern Europe, where grapes refused to grow and the barley froze for half the year, mead became the closest thing to happiness you could find in a cup. The Norsemen treated it as something divine. According to their legends, the gods themselves drank from the mead of poetry, a celestial brew that granted wisdom, eloquence, and occasionally some terrible singing. Viking skalds composed entire verses about it, which might explain why half of their poetry reads like a drunk text that's been carved into a stone. A proper Viking feast wasn't measured by the food. It was measured by how many horns of mead you could survive before you started declaring eternal brotherhood with the furniture. Further south, mead became the traditional wedding drink. Newlyweds were given enough honey wine to last for an entire moon cycle, hence the term honeymoon. It was a romantic tradition that originally involved two people and one very, very long hangover. Peasants, meanwhile, made simpler versions of it with whatever honey they could find, sometimes spiced with herbs, and sometimes with bugs. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. After a long day of laboring in the fields, a warm mug of mead could turn even the grim reality of feudalism into a mild comedy. The monks brewed it too because, well, monks brewed everything. They used mead in medicine, in their cooking, and presumably in diplomacy. It was sweet, it was shelf-stable, and it was a lot easier to bless than wine. By the 13th century, mead started to lose ground to beer and wine, but it never quite disappeared. It just lingered, the quiet, golden ghost of Europe's drinking past. It was a drink born from bees and boredom, reminding everyone that sometimes history doesn't really advance. It just refills the cup. As medieval Europe was perfecting the art of drinking responsibly, which was never, the Islamic world was moving in the complete opposite direction, at least on paper. When Islam spread across the Middle East in the 7th century, it brought with it a very clear message. Alcohol was haram, or forbidden. In theory, that should have put an end to centuries of intoxication. In practice, it just turned drinking into one of history's longest-running inside jokes. Before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula already knew its liquors quite well. The Bedouins brewed date wine. The Persians loved their poetry and pomegranate cocktails. And everyone pretty much agreed that hangovers were a universal experience. Then came the Prophet Muhammad, who outlawed alcohol not out of spite, but for survival. Drunken camel races were ending poorly, and someone had to be the adult in the room. The early caliphs enforced sobriety with an admirable amount of effort, but the empire was growing faster than its own rules. From Spain to Persia, local customs proved to be incredibly resilient. Court poets kept writing suspiciously passionate odes to wine, which they insisted was just a metaphor for divine love. Of course, that divine love also made you hiccup, sing, and confess things to total strangers. Nowhere was this contradiction more delicious than in Baghdad. By the 9th century, it had become the center of art, science, and polite disobedience. The Abbasid caliphs officially banned wine, but kept these private gardens where the fountains didn't always flow with water. The poet Abu Nuwas, who was Baghdad's most charming menace, filled entire volumes with verses about drinking under the moonlight. His lines were so beautiful that religious scholars have spent centuries arguing over whether he was being spiritual or just sarcastic. Meanwhile, physicians were prescribing wine for digestive harmony. Sufis were using intoxication as a metaphor for mystical union, and merchants were quietly trading grapes behind the mosques. The official stance was sobriety. The unofficial one was curiosity. By the 12th century, Islamic chemists had even refined the process of distillation, producing early forms of spirits, though they mostly just called it medicine to avoid any awkward questions. Ironically, the word alcohol itself comes from Arabic, al-kul, which means the essence. The very language that banned it also gave it its name. So yes, the Islamic world went dry officially. Unofficially, it just learned to pour its rebellion into verse. By the 13th century, Europe had finally sobered up just enough to invent the tavern, a public house where everyone could drink together, argue about taxes, and forget they were peasants for a few glorious hours. It was like democracy before democracy existed, only it was louder and slightly stickier. Taverns quickly became the social engine of medieval life. The lords had their castles, the priests had their cathedrals, but ordinary people had the pub. You didn't need wealth or a fancy pedigree to get in, just a thirst and enough coins to make it past the door. Inside, the floor was covered in straw, the air was thick with smoke, and the rules were simple. Drink, sing, and pretend all your problems were the king's fault. They started popping up everywhere, along trade routes near markets and right beside churches, because convenience matters. For travelers, taverns were absolute lifesavers. For the locals, they were like therapy with a handle. It was the one place where a blacksmith could debate theology with a monk, a farmer could complain about his rent to a knight, and everyone could agree that the ale tasted better last week. Alewives, women who brewed and sold their own beer, ran many of these establishments. They were entrepreneurial, they were fierce, and they were often accused of witchcraft, mostly because their success made some men uncomfortable. Their trade signs, brooms, cats, and cauldrons, later inspired much of the witch imagery that we know today. So yes, medieval feminism smelled faintly of hops. Taverns also became the birthplace of politics. Revolutions don't start in palaces. They start wherever someone is shouting, "You know what we should do," over their third mug of ale. From the peasant uprisings in England to the conspiracies that shaped Renaissance Italy, history's boldest ideas often began in places with very questionable sanitation. The authorities hated taverns for that exact reason. Kings feared sedition, priests feared sin, and innkeepers feared running out of beer. Still, taverns managed to survive every single crackdown because shutting down drinking in the Middle Ages was like trying to ban rain. It just moved to a new location. By the end of the 15th century, taverns weren't just hangouts, they were culture. They gave Europe its gossip, its folk songs, its revolutions, and perhaps most importantly, its first public bathrooms. Of a sort, civilization had finally created a place where everyone could gather, disagree, and then stumble home together. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had spent the better part of a millennium drinking its way through disease, famine, and complicated theology. When the Renaissance finally arrived, everyone simply traded their mead for wine and called it progress. This new age of reason was, ironically, completely soaked in alcohol. Scholars would debate astronomy, anatomy, and metaphysics, usually over a jug of something fermented. Da Vinci was known to drink in moderation. Michelangelo preferred wine to water, and Erasmus once joked that no one could think clearly on an empty stomach or with a dry throat. Civilization was sobering up intellectually, but certainly not physically. The printing press was spreading knowledge, but the taverns were spreading opinions much faster. Coffee houses hadn't arrived on the scene yet, so beer remained Europe's unofficial Wi-Fi. It connected merchants, artists, sailors, and anyone who could still afford to buy a cup. New beverages were starting to appear, too. There were distilled spirits coming from alchemists' labs, sweet wines from the Mediterranean, and early tonics that claimed to cure everything except for a hangover. The age of exploration also became the age of exporting alcoholism. European ships carried wine, rum, and brandy to every corner of the known world, ensuring that no civilization would ever again have to suffer the tragedy of sobriety. Colonial merchants made absolute fortunes on sugar and spirits, and sailors drank enough rum to keep scurvy away, or at least to not care about it. Back at home, drinking became a kind of social performance. Royal banquets featured fountains that literally flowed with wine, because nothing says divine right to rule quite like sticky floors. Henry VII brewed his own ale, proving that you can dismantle a church and still be very committed to home brewing. Meanwhile, the peasants continued their eternal tradition of drinking the same weak ale and pretending not to notice that nothing had really changed for them. By the 17th century, Europe was standing on the edge of modernity, with printing, science, and political reform at its fingertips, but it was still firmly clutching its mug. The church had its doctrines, the universities had their logic, and the taverns had better attendance. It's tempting to think of alcohol as just a side note to history, but it's really closer to the soundtrack. From ancient rice brews to Renaissance vineyards, the story of civilization isn't just about invention. It's about endurance. And humanity, ever resourceful, found that a little bit of fermentation made that endurance taste a whole lot better. The year was 41 BCE. Rome stood fractured, its triumvirs holding an uneasy alliance after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony, the brilliant but impulsive general, had been sent east to restore order and secure the loyalty of Rome's provinces. Yet beyond all the politics, a woman was waiting who could alter the course of empires. Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. Antony had summoned her to the city of Tarsus to answer charges that she had aided Caesar's enemies. It was a clear power play, Rome reminding Egypt exactly who ruled the Mediterranean. But Cleopatra had no intention of showing up as a supplicant. Instead, she arrived as a goddess. Her barge sailed up the Cydnus River, draped in purple sails that caught the sun like molten gold. Perfume wafted across the water, and musicians played as her attendants fanned her on her throne. She reclined there beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Isis incarnate, the goddess of fertility and power. When Antony finally laid his eyes on her, the entire balance of power shifted. He had faced down legions, conspiracies, and kings, but he had never faced a woman who could command silence with just a single glance. Cleopatra understood performance better than any ruler of her age. She knew that perception was power, and she had crafted her entrance as carefully as Rome forged its swords. Antony, who was both a soldier and a sensualist, found himself completely enthralled. The two of them dined together that night in a spectacle that outshone any Roman triumph. Banquets of roasted peacocks, jeweled goblets brimming with wine, and laughter that lingered until the dawn. Yet beneath all the silk and gold, there was a strategy. Cleopatra's throne was precarious. Egypt depended on Rome's favor for its very survival. Aligning herself with Antony could secure her kingdom's future, and her son Caesarion's claim as the heir of Julius Caesar. Antony, meanwhile, saw in her not only a lover, but an ally of immense wealth and mystique. Egypt's riches could fuel his own ambitions against his rival, Octavian, back in Rome. That night, two worlds collided: the disciplined steel of Roman authority and the perfumed splendor of Egyptian divinity. Their meeting was more than just passion. It was politics wrapped in seduction, an empire disguised as a romance. And from that very first encounter, neither of them would ever rule or love in the same way again. In the weeks that followed, Mark Antony remained in Cleopatra's orbit, first as her guest, and then as something far more intimate. Their alliance grew not just from desire, but from a shared ambition. Antony saw in Cleopatra the embodiment of everything that Rome had lost: grandeur without restraint, wealth without guilt, a beauty that was entwined with power. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in him the instrument of her political survival, a man who could restore Egypt's influence in the Mediterranean and secure her son's future. Antony was just as captivated by the queen's intellect as he was by her allure. Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages. She was quick with her wit, and she was utterly fearless in any debate. She could discuss philosophy with the same ease that she ordered her fleets into the Nile. Unlike Roman women, who were bound by a strict sense of decorum, Cleopatra ruled with an unashamed sovereignty, To Antony, who had spent years living under the shadow of Caesar and the constant scrutiny of Rome's Senate, her presence was intoxicating. She offered him something the Republic never could: freedom from politics that was disguised as duty. Their days were spent in lavish feasts, philosophical conversations, and carefully staged games. Together, they formed the Inimitable Livers, a private society that was devoted to excess, luxury, and laughter. They would disguise themselves at night and wander through the streets of Alexandria in playful anonymity, drinking with sailors, mocking magistrates, and living like mortals instead of monarchs. The city absolutely adored them. Cleopatra's charisma turned every public appearance into a form of theater, and Antony's rough charm complemented her perfectly. But while they were reveling, the world beyond their golden walls was changing. In Rome, Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son, was watching Antony's behavior with a growing suspicion. Every rumor of debauchery, every tale of Egyptian splendor, reached his ears and only stoked his resentment. To Octavian, Antony was no longer a Roman hero, but a man who had been seduced by an Eastern temptress, one who threatened the very unity of the Republic itself. Still, Antony just dismissed these whispers as envy. He believed his military prowess, and his name could withstand any scandal. Cleopatra encouraged his confidence, gifting him ships, silver, and soldiers to secure his campaigns. Together, they forged not only a romance, but a partnership that was meant to rival the might of Rome. In Alexandria, they were king and queen of both pleasure and power, two rulers in love, defying the empire that was trying to divide them. But Rome, jealous and unrelenting, was already sharpening its knives. By the time Antony returned to Alexandria in 37 BCE, his bond with Cleopatra had evolved from simple indulgence into a calculated alliance. The queen had proven herself to be indispensable. Egypt's treasury was overflowing with grain, gold, and the fabled wealth of the Nile that Rome's legions could never seem to fully plunder. For Antony, who dreamed of surpassing Caesar's glory and ruling the entire Eastern world, Cleopatra was both his muse and his means. She welcomed him with the splendor of a pharaoh. Banquets glittered beneath ceilings of silver stars, and dancers reenacted the divine union of Isis and Osiris, symbolizing their own partnership. Cleopatra presented Antony with gifts not of love, but of empire: ships for his campaigns, soldiers trained in Egyptian archery, and the loyalty of the eastern provinces. In return, Antony granted her territories: Cyprus, Crete, and parts of Syria and Cilicia, restoring much of Egypt's former Ptolemaic domain. It was a gesture that absolutely infuriated Rome, which saw its general carving away pieces of the Republic for a foreign queen. To their followers, however, Antony and Cleopatra appeared as divine counterparts. He was the new Dionysus, the god of wine and conquest, and she was Isis, the mother of kings. Together, they styled themselves as the rulers of the East, openly embracing the kind of monarchical grandeur that Rome pretended to despise, but secretly envied. Antony's Roman discipline began to soften. He started dressing in Eastern robes, adopting Egyptian rituals, and holding court in the lavish palace that overlooked the Nile. Cleopatra bore him twins, a boy and a girl named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, who were symbols of their union's divine legitimacy. Their births were celebrated as omens of a new dynasty that would unite the East and the West. Cleopatra saw in her children not just heirs, but living proof that her bloodline could outlast Rome's. Yet not everyone was rejoicing. In the marble halls of the Senate, whispers had turned into outrage. Antony's distribution of kingdoms to Cleopatra's children, the so-called donations of Alexandria, was viewed as an act of treason. To the Romans, he was no longer a protector of their interests, but a man who had been bewitched, handing the world's riches over to an Egyptian seductress. In their palace, the lovers toasted to eternity beneath the fragrance of lotus and myrrh. But beyond the Nile, storm clouds were gathering. Octavian's propaganda began to paint them as enemies of Roman virtue, a decadent queen and a fallen hero, daring to dream of an empire in defiance of the Republic. As the years passed, Antony and Cleopatra built a world that seemed to float somewhere between myth and power, a realm of pleasure that was gilded by ambition. Alexandria became the beating heart of their empire, where politics were conducted in marble halls perfumed with incense, and feasts became councils of strategy. The queen's court shimmered with philosophers, engineers, and poets, each one serving her vision of an Egypt that was reborn under a divine rule. Antony, the hardened general who had once commanded Rome's armies, found himself completely transformed. No longer bound by the Senate's scorn, he reveled in the Egyptian ideal of kingship, a god among men. He trained his legions by day and feasted by night, hosting spectacles that blurred the line between politics and performance. Cleopatra would join him on parade, dressed in armor, presenting herself as Isis beside her consort Dionysus. Together, they would appear before the crowds on golden thrones, uniting Roman strength and Egyptian divinity in a single image of unchallengeable majesty. Yet behind all the music and the opulence, their empire was teetering on the edge of peril. Antony's campaigns against Parthia, the eastern rival of Rome, had ended in humiliation. The desert had devoured his army, his legions starving and frostbitten, retreating through mountains that were littered with corpses. It was a disaster that Rome would not forgive. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, met him upon his return not with reproach, but with comfort. She financed the rebuilding of his forces, replenished his coffers, and helped restore his pride. Their alliance, which was once romantic, was now bound by necessity and survival. Still, their enemies were multiplying. Octavian, watching from Rome, seized upon Antony's failures and wove them into a scandal. He claimed that Antony had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for the Egyptian queen. Rumors began to spread that Antony was planning to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria and declare Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. In Alexandria, the lovers just dismissed such talk with laughter. Yet the laughter was growing strained. The world beyond their palace was no longer dazzled by their legend. To many Romans, Cleopatra was no longer a queen, but a threat, a foreign sorceress who had ensnared their general and corrupted him with Eastern decadence. Still, for a brief, luminous moment, they ruled as gods in a mortal world, while Rome, restless and vengeful, prepared to strike. By 33 BCE, the illusion of peace between Antony and Octavian had completely shattered. Their alliance, which was once bound by the memory of Julius Caesar, had crumbled under the weight of jealousy, ambition, and fear. Octavian, now the political master of Rome, moved swiftly to turn the entire republic against Antony and Cleopatra. He weaponized rumor with absolute precision, transforming their romance into a scandal and their grandeur into an act of treason. He circulated tales of Cleopatra's sorcery, claiming she had bewitched Antony with foreign magic and reduced him to nothing more than her puppet. Statues of the once great general were mocked in the streets, dressed in silk and gold to resemble an Eastern despot. Pamphlets accused him of giving away Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children and plotting to crown himself and her as the rulers of the world. Octavian presented himself as Rome's savior, promising to free the republic from the enslavement of a foreign queen. The Senate, hungry for an enemy to unite them, followed his lead. Antony, for his part, refused to bow. He still commanded vast armies in the east, and he had the loyalty of seasoned legions who had fought beside him for years. But the damage to his reputation had already been done. In his speeches and letters, Octavian painted him as a traitor who had traded Roman virtue for Egyptian decadence. Even Antony's friends in the Senate began to withdraw, fearful of sharing his fate. Cleopatra understood propaganda just as well as any Roman. She urged Antony to act decisively, to strike before Octavian could consolidate his power. But Antony hesitated, torn between two different worlds: the disciplined general that Rome had made him, and the god-king that Egypt had turned him into. Their love, which was once their greatest strength, now divided him. Cleopatra's counsel was bold, but it came from the perspective of a monarch, not a statesman. She was fighting for a dynasty. He was fighting for his dignity. In 32 BCE, Octavian took the final step. He declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a master stroke. By making the Egyptian queen the enemy, he framed the conflict as one of civilization versus corruption. Rome would march not against one of its own, but against a foreign queen who had dared to seduce a Roman hero. And just like that, love itself became the battlefield. The lovers would have to stand together, knowing that to fight for one another now meant to fight against the greatest empire the world had ever known. As war loomed, Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. The year was 31 BCE, and the air was thick with tension and prophecy. Their combined armies were vast, hundreds of warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and enough gold to fund a decade of conflict. Yet beneath the glitter of all the banners and bronze, a sense of unease lingered. The soldiers were loyal, but the cause was muddled. Were they fighting for Antony's honor or for Cleopatra's crown? Were they fighting for Rome or were they fighting for love? Antony established his headquarters at Patri, while Cleopatra arrived with her fleet, magnificent galleys adorned with purple sails and gilded prows. Her very presence divided his officers. To some, she was a symbol of divine fortune. To others, she was a distraction that eroded their Roman discipline. Commanders whispered that Antony had surrendered his strategy to his passion. Yet Cleopatra brought more than just beauty. She brought money, she brought provisions, and she brought a fleet that had been trained on the Nile, disciplined and fierce. Without her, Antony's campaign would have starved before it had even begun. Their enemies, led by Octavian and his brilliant admiral Agrippa, advanced methodically. Agrippa seized key ports along the western coast, cutting Antony's supply lines and isolating his fleet. Antony's officers urged him to fight on land, where his legions held the advantage. But Cleopatra, wary of another desert disaster, insisted on a naval battle. She believed that her fleet's size and the favorable winds of the Ionian Sea would turn the tide in their favor. Antony, ever torn between love and logic, agreed. The lovers spent their final days before the battle together in a tense stillness, half strategy, half farewell. Cleopatra tried to mask her fear behind a regal poise, while Antony, weary and uncertain, looked for omens that simply refused to favor him. The priest's readings were grim, the stars were indifferent. When dawn broke over the Gulf of Actium, the sea shimmered like a mirror of fate. Antony's ships, massive but unwieldy, faced Octavian's smaller, more agile fleet. Cleopatra's flagship gleamed at the center, a beacon of gold amid the morning mist. On the shore, thousands of soldiers watched, waiting for victory or for the end of everything they served. It was not just a battle between two armies. It was the reckoning of two worlds, Roman order against Egyptian splendor, discipline against desire. And before the sun would set, love itself would be tested by fire and by iron. On the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, the dawn over the Gulf of Actium glowed red, an omen the Egyptians read with a sense of dread. Cleopatra's fleet glittered with golden prows and purple sails, while Antony's warships formed a massive semicircle across the calm sea. On the opposite side, Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, commanded leaner, faster vessels that were perfectly suited for maneuver and discipline. The world's greatest powers were facing each other across the water, and history itself seemed to be holding its breath. The first clash came with the roar of rams striking hulls and the hiss of flaming arrows cutting through the air. Antony's ships, though powerful, were heavy and slow. Agrippa's forces danced around them like hornets, burning their sails and piercing their decks. The chaos grew, and smoke turned the bright day into a choking twilight. Amid the din, Cleopatra's flagship waited behind Antony's line, its golden canopy trembling with the wind. Then, at the height of all the confusion, Cleopatra made her move. Seeing the tide turning against them, or perhaps fearing capture, she raised her sails and steered south, toward the open water. Whether it was panic, a strategy, or a prearranged escape, no one can really say. But Antony, upon seeing her banner retreat, abandoned his command. He leapt into a small vessel and followed her, leaving his entire fleet leaderless. The sight of their commander fleeing completely shattered the morale of his men. Their Roman discipline crumbled into chaos. Ships burned, crews surrendered, and the sea became a graveyard of broken oars and floating corpses. Agrippa's fleet surged forward, crushing what little remained. By nightfall, the battle was over. Rome had triumphed. When Antony finally reached Cleopatra's ship, the two of them met in silence. The victory banquets of Alexandria, the music, the laughter, all of it seemed like relics from another life. Their empire of love had turned to ash. Cleopatra tried to console him, but Antony's eyes were just hollow. He had been a soldier his entire life, and he knew what defeat meant: dishonor, exile, and the slow erasure of his name from history. Together, they sailed back to Egypt under a sky that was devoid of stars. The sea that had once carried their triumphs now bore only their ruin. Actium had not just ended a battle. It had broken the spell that had once bound love and empire together. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after Actium, their once mighty empire was just a shadow of its former glory. The city that had once celebrated their splendor now trembled with uncertainty. The merchants whispered, the nobles watched, and the priests prayed. But everyone could feel it. Rome was coming. Still, within the marble halls of the palace, the lovers refused to yield to despair. Cleopatra filled the courts with music and incense, determined to maintain the illusion of power, even as her world was collapsing around them. Antony, who was once the lion of Rome, was broken. He rarely appeared in public, choosing instead to train what few troops remained with a grim determination. He still had the loyalty of a few thousand men, but his spirit was fading. Cleopatra tried to rekindle his strength, reminding him of his victories, of his name, of his legend. But Antony knew that Octavian's shadow stretched too far to escape. In his heart, he understood that their story was nearing its end. Cleopatra, however, was not done fighting. She began secret negotiations with Octavian, sending emissaries who bore gold and promises. Her message was simple: Egypt would surrender peacefully if her children and her throne were spared. She was hopping to save her dynasty, even if her love could not be saved. Octavian, cold and deliberate, listened. He admired her intellect, but he deeply distrusted her motives. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a symbol, a serpent that was to be displayed, not reasoned with. Antony soon learned of these secret talks. Betrayal, or at least the illusion of it, cut him deeper than any sword ever could. His rage turned into despair. Their love turned into silence. The palace, which had once been filled with laughter, now echoed only with footsteps and the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbor walls. Outside Alexandria, Octavian's legions marched closer, their banners glinting in the desert sun. The Nile Delta filled with the rumble of war machines and the scent of dust and iron. Cleopatra ordered her fleet to be burned to prevent its capture. Flames devoured the last symbol of their defiance, casting black smoke into the Egyptian sky. As night fell over Alexandria, Cleopatra stood upon her balcony and looked toward the west, toward Rome, toward destiny. She knew that her reign, her love, and perhaps even her life would not see another sunrise. The final act was about to begin. By the summer of 30 BCE, the sands of Egypt had turned red with Rome's advance. Octavian's legions were closing in on Alexandria from every direction, their banners gleaming beneath the relentless sun. Cleopatra's forces, outnumbered and demoralized, began to crumble. The city's gates, which were once the pride of the Ptolemies, now stood as mere symbols of defiance against the inevitable. Inside the palace, Cleopatra and Antony faced the end with the same intensity that had defined their love. Antony, haunted by his failure and the loss of his honor, resolved to meet his death as a Roman should. When false news reached him that Cleopatra had taken her own life, he fell upon his sword. As he was bleeding out, his servants rushed in to tell him the truth, that the queen still lived. Mortally wounded, Antony demanded to be taken to her. They carried him to Cleopatra's hidden chamber, where she had taken refuge in her mausoleum, a glittering tomb she had built for herself long before her defeat. As he was lifted up through a window, bleeding and pale, Cleopatra held him in her arms. He died right there, whispering her name, the last word of a soldier who had conquered half the world but had been conquered by love. Octavian entered Alexandria soon after. He found Cleopatra in mourning, but still regal, draped in gold and defiance. He promised her safety, intending to parade her in chains through the streets of Rome as a living trophy of his triumph. But Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, would not be humiliated. She prepared her final act as carefully as she had once prepared her entrance to Antony's court. On the 12th of August, she adorned herself in her royal robes and seated herself upon her throne one last time. At her feet lay a basket of figs, harmless to the eye but deadly within. Concealed among them was an asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt, a symbol of divine royalty and death. As it bit her, Cleopatra remained silent, her face serene. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, somewhere between history and myth. When Octavian found her lifeless body, he realized that he had conquered a kingdom, but he had lost a legend. With Cleopatra's death, the line of the pharaohs came to an end, and Egypt became just another province of Rome. Yet her story of love, power, and defiance would echo through the centuries, as eternal as the Nile itself. For a man who sought to conquer the entire world, Alexander the Great was undone not by swords, but by hearts. He was the son of Philip II, and had been tutored by Aristotle himself. Alexander was raised to see power as his destiny. Yet beneath the armor of the conqueror beat a heart that was far more unpredictable than any army he ever commanded. For all of his victories on the battlefield, his greatest rebellions were often against tradition itself. And nowhere was that clearer than in his marriages. In 327 BCE, after years of relentless campaigning across Asia, Alexander met a woman who would defy every expectation of what a Macedonian queen should be. Her name was Roxana, a Bactrian princess, the daughter of Oxyartes. The story goes that Alexander saw her for the very first time at a feast in the mountain fortress of Sogdian Rock, shortly after his forces had captured it. She danced before him with a dagger in her hand, her movements fierce yet graceful, her eyes completely unflinching. To his generals, she was a captive. To Alexander, she was fire. What happened next shocked his entire court. Instead of sending her back to Macedonia as a trophy or offering her up as a political pawn, Alexander married her. There was no counsel, no negotiation, no alliance building, only love. His men grumbled that he had lost his mind, that the greatest conqueror alive had been conquered by a foreign girl. But Alexander didn't care. For perhaps the first time in his entire life, he acted purely from desire. The ceremony was held according to Persian custom, an act that outraged his Macedonian officers, who saw it as just another sign of Alexander's growing Eastern decadence. Yet to him, it was more than just a romance. It was symbolism. By marrying Roxana, he sought to unite the East and the West, to embody his dream of a single empire where cultures could blend together rather than clash. Roxana, intelligent and proud, quickly adapted to her new role. She was not the docile queen that many had expected. She was possessive, she was cunning, and she was deeply protective of her husband's legacy. Their union was both tender and dangerous, a passion that was entwined with power. And though she bore him no heir during his lifetime, her hold on his heart was absolute. But Alexander's story and his scandal was only just beginning. Love may have chosen Roxana, but politics would soon demand far more from him. Roxana might have won Alexander's heart, but she quickly discovered that she was not his only love. In his world, affection was not bound by gender or by convention. For years, one name had followed Alexander across battlefields and into legend: Hephaestion, his companion since his youth, his confidant in war. Hephaestion was more than just a friend. To many, he was Alexander's other half, the man who understood him in ways that no queen ever could. Roxana soon grew to despise him. She could not rival Hephaestion's history with the king. No feast, no embrace, could ever erase the years they had spent together, riding into battle and sharing command tents. When foreign emissaries would address Hephaestion as Alexander's equal, Roxana's fury would boil. To her, it wasn't politics, it was a betrayal. Alexander, however, refused to choose between them. He loved them both in his own way, and he saw no contradiction in it. His Macedonian officers whispered that their king was losing his sense of decorum, indulging in Persian luxuries and scandalous attachments. Some even mocked him behind closed doors, calling Hephaestion the second Alexander, but none of them ever dared to confront him openly. Alexander's temper was as legendary as his affection. When Roxana's jealousy became too fierce to hide, Alexander distanced himself from her. Yet she remained his wife, fiercely devoted, her influence growing quietly behind the palace walls. She understood one truth about Alexander that even Hephaestion sometimes ignored: his need to control his own destiny, even in matters of the heart. Then in 324 BCE, tragedy struck. Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana and died suddenly. Alexander was absolutely inconsolable. He tore his clothes, he refused to eat, and he ordered temples to be built in Hephaestion's honor. He even declared him a demigod, an act that was unheard of for a mortal. The court stood in a stunned silence, realizing that no one, not even Roxana, had ever commanded such devotion from him. For Roxana, Hephaestion's death brought a twisted kind of relief, but it also left her husband completely hollow. She had won the war of jealousy, but at the cost of his soul. In the days that followed, Alexander just wandered the palace like a ghost. The man who had conquered the world now faced a kingdom that he could not subdue: grief. And soon, that grief would drive him into new alliances and new scandals. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's grief burned into a restless ambition. He needed a distraction, something grand enough to drown out his sorrow. That something came in the form of his empire. By 324 BCE, he ruled from Greece all the way to the Indus River. Yet he knew that conquest alone could not bind his world together. He sought to fuse the bloodlines of Macedonia and Persia, creating a new ruling class that was loyal only to him. And as with all of Alexander's visions, it began with a marriage. At Susa, the Persian ceremonial capital, he staged a spectacle that the world had never seen before. 90 of his leading officers were to wed noble Persian women in a mass ceremony that was designed to symbolize the unity between the East and the West. At the center of it all, Alexander himself took 2 more brides: Stateira, the daughter of the defeated King Darius III, and Parysatis, the daughter of the Persian king Artaxerxes. It was pure politics, disguised as romance. The marriages cemented his claim to the Achaemenid royal line, legitimizing his rule in Persian eyes. But back in the Macedonian ranks, disgust was simmering. The soldiers who had followed him through deserts and across battlefields now watched their king, dressed in Persian robes, kneeling before a foreign princess. To them, it was a betrayal. The man who was once hailed as the defender of Greece now looked like the heir of Persia. Roxana, who was still the queen in name, was not invited to the ceremony. Her jealousy was volcanic. She had risked everything to be Alexander's chosen one, and now she was being overshadowed by royal brides with higher birth and more political significance. But she knew her husband well. Power moved him more than passion ever could. She remained in the shadows, calculating, silent, and waiting for her moment. For Alexander, however, this union was more than just symbolic. He believed himself to be the divine bridge between civilizations, a living embodiment of the gods. These marriages were meant to seal his vision of one world, one empire, one destiny. Yet, even as he stood among the garlands and the incense, clasping the hands of Darius's daughter, murmurs of discontent echoed through his court. His Macedonian officers muttered that their king was lost, no longer one of them, but a Persian in spirit. Alexander didn't care. He had wedded not just women, but entire nations. But love, power, and legacy rarely share the same bed. The weddings at Susa were meant to unify Alexander's empire, but instead, they fractured his army. To the Macedonians, who had marched with him all the way from Pella, their king's new Persian identity was a bitter insult. He now wore flowing robes. He demanded prostration before his throne, and he spoke of himself not just as a king, but as a living god. What had once begun as admiration for their leader was slowly turning into a quiet resentment. At the victory feasts, Persian nobles now sat beside Macedonian officers as equals, an unthinkable sight to men who had spent years shedding their blood to defeat them. Alexander's vision of cultural fusion might have sounded noble in theory, but in practice, it just felt like betrayal. The soldiers began to whisper that their king had gone mad, that he cared more for the Persians he had conquered than for the men who had followed him. The real scandal came when Alexander publicly kissed one of his Persian companions, Bagoas, during a festival, right in front of his entire court. The gesture absolutely stunned the Macedonians. To them, such open affection between men, especially from their king, was a humiliation. Bagoas had once been a favorite of Darius III, and now he had become Alexander's. The symbolism was just too much for them to bear. The Macedonian lion had inherited not only Persia's empire, but its courtiers and their vices as well. Some officers tried to remind Alexander of who he was, a Greek king, not an Eastern despot. But Alexander had long since stopped listening. He surrounded himself with flatterers and mystics who called him the son of Zeus Ammon, destined to rule as a god among men. Those who resisted his transformation often met with grim fates. Cleitus the Black, one of his oldest companions, was slain by Alexander's own hand after he dared to criticize him during a drunken quarrel. By the time the army reached Babylon, the divide was complete. The soldiers still worshipped their general, but they no longer understood their king. To them, he was lost, consumed by Persian luxury and blinded by love and ambition. But Alexander saw something that they could not, an empire bound not by swords, but by marriage, by ritual, and by faith. His vision was magnificent, it was terrifying, and it was utterly his own. And it was about to consume him. Roxana's silence after the weddings at Susa was not a sign of forgiveness, it was calculation. She had watched Alexander take two Persian princesses as his wives before the eyes of the entire world. And though she smiled for the sake of the ceremony, her fury ran deep. She had once been the only woman in his life, the symbol of his love that went beyond politics. Now, she was just a shadow beside two royal brides who had a greater lineage and richer dowries. But Roxana was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly. While Alexander was celebrating unity, Roxana was studying survival. She knew that in this new empire of blended cultures, the most dangerous battles were fought in the bedroom, not on the battlefield. Her rival, Statera, the daughter of Darius, was a symbol of Persia's royal bloodline, a woman whose very existence legitimized Alexander's rule. Roxana understood exactly what that meant. If Alexander were to die, Statera's son could one day inherit the entire empire. Roxana could not allow that to happen. Her patience finally ended when Alexander fell ill in Babylon in 323 BCE. As the king's strength began to fade, the court fractured. Generals whispered, wives waited, and ambitions bloomed in every single corridor. When the conqueror of the world finally died, chaos erupted. Roxana moved with a terrifying precision. She summoned Statera and her sister to Babylon under the guise of reconciliation, and then she had them both murdered. Their bodies were quietly buried, their names completely erased. Roxana's child with Alexander would now be the only heir to his legacy. It was a ruthless act, but in the world that Alexander had built, mercy was a weakness. The same woman who had once danced before him, with a blade in her hand, now wielded it in his absence. The Macedonian officers turned pale at the rumor of what she had done, yet none of them dared to challenge her. She was, after all, the mother of Alexander's son, and in the fragile order that was left behind, that gave her a power that few could touch. Still, her vengeance came at a price. Roxana gained the throne of an empire, but she lost the love that had once defined her. In her attempt to protect her place in history, she became the very thing she had once feared, a pawn of politics, a queen surrounded by ghosts. Alexander had conquered nations. Roxana had conquered the aftermath. The empire that Alexander left behind was as vast as it was unstable, stitched together by blood, ambition, and a love that had gone wrong. After his death, the so-called successors, his generals tore the world apart in their struggle for power. But amid all this chaos, one haunting reminder of his vision remained: the widows of Susa. The grand marriages that had once symbolized unity were now just cursed relics. Most of the Macedonian officers abandoned their Persian wives the moment Alexander's body grew cold. They saw the unions for what they had always been: political theater. The grand dream of a fusion between the East and the West dissolved into resentment and betrayal. For every Persian woman who was left behind, there was a Macedonian general who was eager to forget the entire experiment. Statera, Alexander's Persian bride, was already dead, slain by Roxana's jealousy. But whispers of her ghost began to spread among the Persian court. Some said her spirit wandered the palace corridors of Babylon, mourning the husband who had wedded her for an empire rather than for love. Her death became a legend, the first blood that was spilled in the disintegration of Alexander's dream. Roxana, now the mother of the king's only legitimate heir, Alexander IV, found herself surrounded by vultures. The generals who had once bowed to her husband now looked at her child as just a pawn, a symbol to legitimize their own power grabs. She remained guarded, sharp, and ruthlessly aware that the world her husband had built was now turning against itself. In the east, Persian nobles lamented the loss of the Achaemenid line. To them, Alexander's marriages had been a blasphemy, a Greek conqueror trying to wear their crown. In the west, Macedonian veterans scoffed that their king had gone native, calling his Persian weddings the final proof of his corruption. The empire he had married together now divorced itself along the very same cultural lines he had tried so hard to erase. The ghosts of Susa were not just the abandoned wives or the murdered princesses. They were the dying echoes of Alexander's impossible dream. His attempt to unite hearts and empires had failed. What remained was grief, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of everything he had once held sacred. After Alexander's death, Roxana became both a queen and a prisoner, a woman trapped in the empire her husband had built but could no longer hold together. Her only protection was the child she carried, Alexander's son, the infant who would be known as Alexander IV. That child was her crown, her shield, and her curse. Every single general in the fractured empire saw him as a tool, the key to legitimacy in a world that was now ruled by ambition and steel. Roxana fled from Babylon under the protection of Perdiccas, Alexander's trusted lieutenant, who claimed to be guarding the royal family. But loyalty in this new world was as fragile as glass. The generals, Ptolemy in Egypt, Antigonus in Asia, Cassander in Macedonia, were carving up the empire piece by piece. None of them feared Roxana. They feared the name that her child bore. The boy represented unity, something that none of them could allow to survive. Still, Roxana played her part shrewdly. She projected the image of a grieving widow, meek and loyal, while quietly maneuvering behind the scenes. She constantly reminded those around her that her son was not just a prince. He was the living blood of Alexander the Great, born of both Macedonian and Persian lines. It was a story she wielded like a weapon, invoking the memory of the man that no one dared to openly betray. But time was cruel. The world had no place for a child king or a queen without an army. Perdiccas was soon murdered, and with his death, Roxana lost her last true ally. She and her son were taken to Macedonia and placed under the protection of Cassander, a man whose smile concealed the patience of a serpent. For years, Roxana kept the boy hidden, teaching him tales of his father's greatness, whispering that one day he would reclaim his birthright. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. Alexander's empire was dead, and so was the dream that had once bound it together. By the time her son reached adolescence, Cassandra no longer needed symbols. Quietly and efficiently, he ended the last chapter of Alexander's bloodline. Roxana and her son were executed in secret. The world moved on, and the widow who had once ruled the greatest empire on earth simply vanished, leaving only a legend in her place. By the time Roxana and her son had vanished from the world, Alexander's story had already begun to slip into legend. His empire had splintered, his generals had crowned themselves kings, and the dream of a united world lay in ruins. Yet amid the smoke of forgotten cities, one truth endured: that no man had ever loved, ruled, or defied convention quite like Alexander. His passions were as vast as his conquests, and his marriages revealed the soul of a man who was torn between love and legacy. The people of his empire told different stories, depending on where they lived. To the Persians, Alexander was the foreign god-king who had tried to blend their bloodlines with Macedonian steel. To the Greeks, he was the tragic genius who had lost himself to Eastern decadence. And to his soldiers, the men who had followed him through deserts and across the Hindu Kush, he was something far stranger, a man too human to be a god, yet too godlike to be fully human. His loves, too, became a part of that mythology. Roxana, the wild beauty from the mountains, came to symbolize passion, love at first sight, fierce and doomed. Statera, the daughter of Darius, represented diplomacy and empire, the marriage of the conqueror and the conquered. And somewhere in between stood Hephaestion, the soulmate, the mirror of Alexander's own restless heart. Together, they formed the trinity of his desire: the lover, the queen, and the companion, each one embodying a different facet of who he was. The Macedonians, who had once mocked his Persian customs, later told tales of divine signs at his weddings, of omens that had foretold both his death and his glory. Poets in Alexandria compared him to Achilles and Patroclus, while Persian storytellers claimed that Roxana's child would one day return as a god reborn. Even centuries later, Roman emperors and medieval kings would look to Alexander's life for inspiration and to his loves for a warning. For in the end, Alexander's marriages were more than just a scandal. They were a prophecy. They revealed the cost of a vision, the price of uniting worlds that were never meant to merge. His empire perished. His wives died. His son was silenced. But the legend of the man who loved too boldly, ruled too widely, and lived too fiercely would never die. In the centuries that followed his death, Alexander became more of a myth than a man. Historians chronicled his victories, poets praised his courage, and rulers across continents sought to claim his bloodline or his blessing. But the stories that lingered most vividly were not only about the cities he burned or the kingdoms he built. They were about the people who loved him and the ruin that those loves left behind. The marriages that had once scandalized his court became symbols of his contradictions. Roxana, the wild bride of passion, was murdered in obscurity. Statera, the royal bridge to Persia, was slain for her lineage. Hephaestion, his companion of the soul, was gone before him, leaving a void that no crown could ever fill. And Alexander himself, the man who thought he could unite love and empire, was buried in a tomb that no one can find. Together, their lives formed a tragedy as grand as any epic, not of conquest, but of the human heart. In trying to merge the East and the West, Alexander tried to merge himself, the Greek hero and the Persian god, the lover and the conqueror, the mortal and the divine. But his marriages revealed that no man, not even one who had conquered the world, could conquer his own nature. His vision of unity had demanded that love serve politics, and that politics serve love, an impossible balance that left only blood and legend in its wake. His generals learned that lesson too late. The empires they carved from his corpse lasted for mere decades before they devoured each other. The dream of a single world, born in a moment of ambition and sealed in the wedding halls of Susa, dissolved into centuries of war. What Alexander had joined through desire, history tore apart through greed. And yet, perhaps that was always his fate. Men like Alexander were not meant to build peace. They were meant to burn so brightly that their ashes would light the ages. His loves were the mirrors of his empire, vast, beautiful, and doomed to collapse under their own weight. In the end, Alexander left behind no heirs, no peace, and no resting place. Only a legacy of brilliance and the eternal whisper of the lovers who followed him into history's shadow. The day in a Roman legionary camp began not with the sunlight, but with the sharp cry of the tuba, the Roman trumpet that cut through the morning air like a blade. Before dawn, thousands of men would stir within the rows of leather tents, each soldier wrapped in his cloak, his gear neatly stacked beside him. There was no such thing as sleeping in. The Roman army valued punctuality far more than comfort. Within moments, an entire camp would awake as one, a machine of men and discipline. The very first task of the day was to dismantle the previous night's camp. Every tent, every tool, and every weapon had its proper place. The legionaries moved with a mechanical precision, folding the leather tents, gathering stakes, and packing the camp's portable altars. Fires were doused, their ashes buried. Not even a single scrap of waste was ever left behind. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like chaos, but to Rome, it was an art form, an order that was forged from pure routine. Soon after came breakfast, which was usually just cold bread, some cheese and water or a sour wine, eaten quickly and in silence. Officers would bark out orders while the centurions paced the lines, checking that every single man was properly equipped. Helmets gleamed, sandals were strapped tight, and shields rested against packs that could weigh nearly 30 kilograms. Each soldier carried his own kit, cooking tools, stakes for the palisades, his rations, and his personal gear. Rome didn't rely on servants. The legionary was the army. Then came the march. The cornicen would blow another signal, and like clockwork, the legions would fall into formation. The standard bearers raised the eagles high, and the column began to move, thousands of ironclad feet striking the earth in perfect unison. Dust would rise, birds would scatter, and the sound of marching boots rolled across the land like thunder. They would walk for miles before ever stopping. The empire's unstoppable tide, inching forward one measured step at a time. Yet before nightfall, they would build it all again, a new fortress rising from the ground with the same precision as the last. Every camp, every trench, every wall was part of the rhythm of the empire. This was the secret of Rome's strength. It wasn't just its swords, but its discipline. Even at dawn, when the rest of the world was still asleep, the legions were already at work, turning the wilderness into civilization, one trumpet call at a time. Once the last trumpet call faded, the march began, not in chaos but with a flawless precision. A Roman legion on the move was the most disciplined sight the ancient world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of men, each one carrying nearly half his body weight in armor and gear, moved in a tight formation along roads that had been carved by their own hands. The column would stretch for miles, but every step, every pause, and every command followed the exact same rhythm, as if the entire army shared a single heartbeat. The order of the march was sacred. Scouts would ride ahead to secure the route, followed by engineers and surveyors who measured distances and marked where the next camp would be built. Behind them came the vexillarii, the standard bearers, who carried the banners that identified each unit. Then came the legionaries, shoulder to shoulder, their shields strapped to their backs and their armor clinking in perfect unison. The sound was hypnotic, iron, dust, and pure determination. Each man carried his entire world with him. His sarsana, the marching pack, contained his tools, his ration, spare sandals, stakes for the palisades, a cooking pot, and a few personal tokens. The soldiers called themselves Muli Mariani, or Marius's mules, after the general who had once reformed the legions to carry their own burdens. They would grumble, but they carried on. Complaining was allowed, stopping was not. The centurions marched at the edges of the column, their vine staffs ready to strike at anyone who dared to break formation. Discipline was absolute. If a soldier dropped out without permission, he risked being lashed or worse. The Romans believed that fear and pride were what kept men in line, and both were present in abundance. The heat of the day brought exhaustion. Dust would stick to their sweat, and the armor would bite into their shoulders. Yet the legions marched relentlessly, often covering 20 miles before noon. To them, hardship was just routine. Comfort was a weakness. Even the generals, including Caesar himself, would often walk beside their men, showing that Rome's greatness was built not by nobles, but by pure endurance. When the day's journey finally ended, no rest was waiting for them. The second trumpet would sound soon, the signal that marked the next stage of their endless ritual. For the Roman soldiers, the march was never really over. Each day simply ended where the next fortress began. As the day's march drew to a close, the legions would halt at the signal of the trumpet. But their work was far from over. The moment a suitable spot was chosen, ideally a flat area near water and away from any ambush points, the Roman army transformed from a marching column into an army of engineers. Every single evening, they would build an entire fortified camp completely from scratch. The praefectus castrorum, or camp prefect, and his surveyors would begin the process. Using wooden staffs, measuring cords, and a device called a groma, they laid out the precise dimensions of the camp. Every camp followed the exact same pattern, regardless of the terrain or the distance they had marched that day. The Romans could take a patch of wilderness and turn it into a miniature city in less than a few hours. Legionaries would drop their heavy packs, pick up shovels, axes, and pickaxes, and immediately begin to dig. Ditches were carved in perfect rectangles, usually 2 meters deep, surrounding the camp like a moat. The earth from the trenches was piled inward to form a rampart, which was the foundation of the vallum, or the defensive wall. Wooden stakes were then driven in to create a palisade, as sharp as spears, ready to repel any attackers. Every man had his specific duty. The engineers oversaw the construction, the legionaries dug and hammered, and the centurions roamed the site like hawks, making sure the walls were straight and the work was relentless. Even when they were exhausted from the day's march, no soldier ever dared to slack off. Discipline was survival. A careless hand could doom thousands if an enemy decided to strike by night. Inside the walls, order ruled. The streets were marked out in perfect right angles, with the main road, the Via Principalis, dividing the camp. The general's tent stood right at the center, surrounded by the headquarters, the armories, and the granaries. Each cohort had its own designated space, every tent lined up as neatly as a row of tiles. When the final stake was hammered in and the trench was completed, the tuba would sound again. The men would exhale, not in rest but in readiness. Fires were lit, guards were posted, and the sentries took their stations. From above, a Roman camp would glow like a pattern of stars, a geometry that was forged in discipline and iron. Every single night, they built their safety with their own hands. And every single dawn, they would tear it all down again. As twilight settled, the newly built fortress pulsed with order and routine. Within the freshly dug walls of the camp, there was no confusion, only a sense of purpose. Every street, every tent, and every pathway had its meaning, laid out with a mathematical precision. The Romans did not merely camp. They constructed a piece of civilization wherever they happened to stop. At the very center of it all stood the praetorium, the commander's tent. It was larger than any other, marked by standards that fluttered in the evening breeze. Here, the general would plan the next day's march, issue his orders, and dine surrounded by his officers. Maps would be spread across wooden tables, candles would flicker against bronze armor, and decisions that would shape entire empires were made over bread and wine. Around the praetorium lay the administrative heart of the camp, the Principia. This was where the records were kept, the pay was distributed, and any messages were received. It also served as a shrine for the legion's standards, the sacred emblems that the soldiers had sworn to defend with their very lives. Losing a standard was considered to be worse than death. Regaining one could redeem an entire legion's honor. To one side stood the quaestorium, a guarded area that held the army's supplies, food, weapons, siege tools, and the treasury. Every single item was counted, sealed, and recorded. The Romans understood that war was not won by swords alone, but by logistics. Grain and discipline were just as vital as courage and steel. Farther out, rows of leather tents filled the camp, perfectly aligned like the streets of a city. Each contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers, shared one tent and a small cooking area. This is where the men would joke, argue, and mend their gear. The smell of wood smoke and boiled lentils would drift through the air. Laughter would mix with the clang of armor being repaired and the rhythmic scrape of whetstones on blades. The evening meals were humble: barley porridge, cheese, dried meat, and some watered-down wine. Yet for men who had marched for miles and dug for hours, it was a feast. The centurions would walk the lines, ensuring discipline, while the engineers checked the fortifications. Every sound had its order, every task had its reason. As the night deepened, torches would burn in even intervals, casting long shadows across the camp streets. The praetorium would glow faintly at its heart, a reminder that this was not just a resting place, but a living fortress, beating in a perfect Roman rhythm. As the camp settled into the evening, the daily rhythm of a Roman legionary continued, one that was built on order, repetition, and sheer endurance. There was no real leisure, only the illusion of rest. Every single action, even the simplest one, had its place within the structure of military discipline. After constructing the fortifications, the soldiers would turn to maintenance. Their armor had to be polished, their weapons had to be sharpened, and their shields had to be inspected for any cracks. Neglect was simply not tolerated. Rust and dull edges could mean death in a battle. The camp would ring with the rasp of whetstones, the creak of leather being repaired, and the quiet murmur of men speaking Latin, Greek, or their own native dialects. 1,000 different tongues, all bound by the same iron code. Dinner would come next. Each contubernium, a group of 8 men, would gather around their small fire to cook a shared meal. The food was simple: barley porridge, beans, cheese, and sometimes a piece of salted pork. It wasn't much, but it was consistent, and in the Roman army, consistency meant survival. The soldiers carried their own cooking tools, their own grain, and even their own mills. A Roman legion was completely self-sufficient, a mobile city that fed, armed, and maintained itself without ever depending on local supplies. Once they were fed, the men would clean their area meticulously. Waste was buried, tools were neatly arranged, and the fires were extinguished, except for the ones that were kept for the watch duties. Order was sacred. An untidy camp was a punishable offense. The centurions would make their rounds, inspecting the tents and checking their lists. They were the very backbone of the army, hard men, who enforced Rome's will with both courage and cruelty. As dusk deepened, the tuba sounded once again, the signal for the evening watch. Guards would take their positions along the ramparts and the gates, their torches flickering against the new walls they had built only hours before. Beyond the camp's perimeter stretched the wilderness, forests, hills, or barren plains filled with the unknown. Inside, everything was under control. Outside, chaos was waiting. Before they slept, prayers were offered. Some soldiers would whisper to Mars for strength, while others would pray to household gods from homes that were far away. Then came the silence, a heavy, disciplined stillness that was broken only by the footsteps of the sentries and the distant hoot of owls. For the legionary, peace was not the absence of war. It was just the brief calm between the trumpet calls. As darkness blanketed the camp, the illusion of rest gave way to vigilance. The Romans never slept carelessly. They understood that danger did not simply vanish with the daylight. Each night, a strict order governed who watched, who slept, and who would have to answer for any failure. The Vigiliae Nocturni, or the night watches, divided the hours between sunset and dawn into 4 distinct shifts. Every soldier knew when he was supposed to be on guard, and every centurion knew that a single mistake could get them all destroyed. At the start of the first watch, the tribune and the senior centurions would inspect the sentries who were stationed along the vallum, the earthen wall that was crowned with wooden stakes. Torches would flicker across the perimeter, their glow bouncing off of the iron helmets. Sentries stood at regular intervals, peering into the night that lay beyond the trench. They carried spears and wore their armor even while they were guarding, because an attack could come at any moment. A raiding party, a band of thieves, or worse, a stealthy enemy just waiting for sleep to dull the Roman edge. Each guard shift lasted for roughly 3 hours and was marked by the rhythmic sound of the bucina, the curved horn that signaled the change of the watch. When one guard's duty ended, another would replace him seamlessly. No shift was ever left empty. No gate was ever left unwatched. If a soldier was caught sleeping on duty, the punishment was swift and brutal, often death by stoning or a beating at the hands of his own comrades. Discipline in the legions was not just about obedience, it was about survival. The fear of dishonor ran deeper than the fear of pain. To let down one's cohort was to invite the scorn of every man who was trusting his life to your vigilance. Inside the camp, the rest of the soldiers would lie in their tents, sleeping lightly beneath their cloaks, their shields stacked by the entrance, ready at a moment's notice. Even in their slumber, a Roman legion was a weapon that was poised to strike. Occasionally, the officers would make silent rounds to ensure that order was being maintained. A single shout of ad signa, to arms, could rouse the entire camp in a matter of minutes. Outside the palisade, the world was silent. There was only the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, the crackle of the torches, and the metallic breath of the soldiers who were standing watch. Within that disciplined darkness, Rome's true strength revealed itself. not in conquest but in control. Before dawn, the camp would stir once again to the sound of the tuba. To the legionary, morning meant movement, and movement meant dismantling everything he had built the night before. Rest was only temporary. Permanence belonged only to Rome itself. Within minutes, thousands of men would be awake, rolling up their cloaks, stamping out the dying embers, and collapsing their tents with a practiced efficiency. Every tent and every stake had its exact place, and each man knew his part. There were 8 soldiers to a tent, and each one was responsible for one section of the contubernium. Some would fold the leather coverings, while others packed the wooden poles or gathered the cooking tools. Nothing was ever left behind, not even the ashes from the previous night's fires. The Romans prided themselves on leaving no trace of their presence, except for the straight line of a road and the echo of their discipline. As the sky began to lighten, the questors would oversee the packing of the supplies, the food rations, the siege equipment, and the portable altars that were used for the daily sacrifices. The camp prefect would check the walls one last time before giving the signal to strike them down. In less than an hour, the fortress that had guarded 10,000 men would simply vanish. Its walls would be reduced to piles of earth, its gates taken apart plank by plank. The legions would form up once more, their armor gleaming with dew, shields strapped to their backs, and tools hanging from their belts. Every soldier's pack weighed nearly 30 kilograms, a burden that was carried without complaint. The centurions would inspect their ranks, ensuring that not a single helmet, strap, or sandal was out of order. Perfection wasn't about vanity, it was about survival. Before they marched, the augur would perform a short ritual, reading the omens from the flight of the birds or the shape of the smoke from the morning fires. The soldiers would watch in silence. To defy an omen was to risk disaster. To follow it was to honor the gods of war. Only when the priest nodded would the trumpet sound again. And then, with the rising sun glinting off of the bronze and iron, the column would begin to move. Dust would rise from the earth as the legions left behind another invisible city, a fortress that had existed for only one night. For the Roman soldier, the pattern never changed. Build, rest, dismantle, march. Their days were an endless repetition. Their purpose was eternal. Once the camp was dismantled, the army began its daily pilgrimage through the empire, a moving city of discipline, sweat, and iron. The morning air was sharp, filled with the sounds of clinking armor and the rhythmic thud of sandals on the packed earth. The legions marched in a perfect formation, each man keeping pace to the beat of the cornison's horn. To watch them move was to see order made flesh, an army so precise that even nature itself seemed to step aside. At the front rode the scouts and the engineers, clearing away obstacles and marking the route. Behind them came the standard bearers, holding the sacred eagles high. Each banner fluttered with pride, the embodiment of Rome's very soul. The legionaries followed, divided by cohort, their red cloaks swaying in the wind. Every few miles the trumpets would blare, signaling them to rest, to adjust their formation or to resume the march. The Roman army didn't just wander, it measured the world in footsteps. Every man carried not only his weapons, but civilization itself. Roads were carved as they advanced, ditches were filled, and bridges were built where none had existed before. To follow a Roman legion was to follow progress, for in their wake came trade, law, and the Latin tongue. Villages would tremble as they passed, not just from fear but from awe. Rome's power was not in its brutality alone, but in the precision of its soldiers, who could fight like wolves and build like gods. The pace was relentless. A full day's march could cover up to 20 miles, and beneath the sun, their armor would heat up like an oven. The dust would cling to their sweat, and every breath would taste of metal and earth. Yet the men never faltered. The centurions would bark their commands, striking any laggards with their vine staffs. To fall behind was a humiliation. To endure was an honor. Occasionally, the column would cross rivers, and their engineers would throw up bridges from timber and rope in a matter of hours. Even the smallest delay was completely unacceptable. Rome's armies did not wait, they made the world move for them. By late afternoon, the horizon would shimmer with the heat. The men's shadows would grow long, and a deep fatigue would set in. But the order never broke. The tuba would soon sound again, not for them to rest, but for them to build. For wherever they stopped, Rome would rise anew from the dust, one fortress at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Roman legions prepared for the cycle to begin all over again. The day might have ended, but the machine of the empire did not rest. When the order came to halt, the engineers would ride ahead to mark the next camp's perimeter, driving stakes into the ground and planting flags to designate where each cohort would stand. Behind them, the soldiers would arrive in waves, weary, sweating, silent, and once more they would begin their nightly ritual of creation. The land itself would bend to the Roman design. Trenches were dug, ramparts were raised, and palisades were hammered together in a rhythmic unity. Fires would flicker along the perimeter, their glow spreading across the plain like molten gold. The legionaries worked swiftly, almost mechanically. They had done this so many times that even their exhaustion could not slow them down. It was muscle memory, a civilization's heartbeat echoing through the hands of its men. By nightfall, the new fortress was complete, perfectly measured, fortified, and alive. The officers would dine near the praetorium, eating from bronze plates and discussing their maps under the lamplight. The rank and file would gather by their fires, joking, gambling with dice, or telling stories of home, of farms in Latium, wives in Campania, or the taste of wine from Gaul. Yet even in these brief moments of warmth, discipline never slept. The guards rotated through their shifts, scouts slipped beyond the walls to monitor the darkness, and the centurions paced the lines, their eyes as sharp as blades. From a distance, the camp looked like a star that had fallen to earth, a square of light, geometric and unyielding, surrounded by a deep blackness. Every fortress, Every trench, every single footprint that was carved into the soil was a statement that Rome could impose its order anywhere. The wilderness became a grid work. The night became the day. When morning came, the trumpets would sound again. The walls would fall. The camp would vanish, and the army would move on, leaving behind nothing but the faint imprint of perfection. For the Roman legionary, life was an endless march between creation and destruction, between chaos and command. This was how Rome conquered the world, not merely through war, but through habit, through the rhythm of men who built a fortress each night, tore it down each dawn, and called it peace. The empire slept in no bed, because Rome itself never slept.